Hello, I have perfected the Plucky Squire on Steam by collecting all 20 achievements. This includes fighting an art scroll, jumping off the desk, defeating Hump Grump, and a lot more we'll touch on a bit later. Welcome to my full review. The Plucky Squire is a 3-dimensional action platforming adventure being developed by All Possible Futures and published by Devolver Digital. Starting off with the settings, visually, it's clean and I much admire the hand-drawn aesthetic. Now as you'd expect, the graphics hold your display and quality settings. The audio is nicely separated, and the controls is where you'll find your key bindings and the option to switch your sticks if you so desire. Controller is based purely off the Xbox control scheme with no support for any others. I would have much preferred an option to swap the decals over to PlayStation instead of having to purchase the game there, but that isn't exactly a deal breaker. The default binds are quite comfortable once you know what does what. As for the keyboard and mouse, the game is playable, and honestly it doesn't feel half bad. It's still very much a controller game, which is heavily suggested, but if that's all you got, it's still worth a shot. The game is also Steam Deck verified for any of you mobile gamers. I'm poor, so I cannot give you further information. Now what I found weird is the gameplay tab only holds vibration options, which I mean is helpful, but I don't know why you wouldn't just throw these under the controls tab to save space. Last but not least is the accessibility tab, which holds all the cheatsy options. This is mostly for those too young to understand basic mechanics or those looking for a soul story experience without worry about combat. As for the technical side of things, please note I'm running this off a low to high-end PC, so how this performs for me might not perform the same for you. With that being said, I ran the game perfectly fine and had little to no hardware related issues. However, I had a great chunk of game related ones. The first being with tearing. There are a lot of transition and cutscenes, so I heavily recommend turning on VSync way before these problems even arise. All of my other issues come down to the vast amount of bugs and glitches left in the game, but before I just rip them apart, nearing the end of my playthrough, they quickly patched a lot of the complaints I was going to make and are still continuing to iron them out, so I think it's simply fair to not mention those. I will, however, be mentioning the few repeated after the patches, such as if you manage to flip the book as another cutscene is about to happen, it will continue said cutscene while you're just forced to stare at the front or back of the book. Very weird. At one point you'll also need to catch some piggies and put them back where they belong. But when you stuff them inside this house, which I thought was correct, some will appear on top of it once you leave. You also can't move them once they're placed, so you're just stuck looking at them like this until you move on. Now the biggest issue I had was with random locations in the world not loading and leaving a blank white canvas. It will wait for your character to be inside before even attempting to load. I found these all a bit funny, however it can be quite immersion and game breaking to say the least. I'm confident by the time you're watching this review, most of these problems will be patched, or so we can hope. As for the difficulty, there are two options, Adventure and Story Mode. I played through everything on Adventure as I wanted the raw experience and much prefer a challenge. The only real difference between the two is how many hits an enemy takes to squash down. No matter the mode you choose, the difficulty comes into play with how well you can platform and understand basic puzzles. That being said, if you struggle at all with anything put in place, there are multiple hint systems around and even an entire settings menu to make the game a whole lot easier. For example, if you happen to struggle with combat, you can become invincible and make the enemies one hit. On the difficulty scale, I think it's easy peasy. Some parts will take a little more brain power than others, but I quite literally breezed through the entire game. As for its replayability, there isn't any reason to do so unless you're after a full completion. The game does allow you to replay any chapter you've already completed, which I thought was great, but you won't miss out on anything aside from collectibles after your first time through. As for the gameplay, in short, the Plucky Squire is a 3-dimensional, story-focused, puzzle platforming adventure where you play as the main character named Jot, who can jump between 2 and 3D realms and hopes to save his friends from the evil Hump Grump. The game is heavily inspired by classic titles such as the original Zelda, which you may have already noticed. Starting from the very beginning, there is no real tutorial outside of being vocally told your goal and reading a few signposts, which I thought was lovely. However, the downside is the entire game can feel like one big tutorial. You are constantly reminded what you should be doing and even straight up told some of the puzzle's answers before getting a chance to attempt it yourself. I can understand the younger audience requiring this handholding, but it felt horrible in later chapters. I want the challenge I signed up for, not to be entirely spoon-fed. Speaking of challenges, the puzzles of the game are all very well thought out, whether it be murdering everything in sight, swapping words to change the environment, or moving objects between realms to create a path forward. The game does a lot of new things I've not seen elsewhere, which is remarkable and worthy of attention. The large majority of puzzles are all pretty chill, to the point I didn't struggle with any for too long. However, if you do, the game offers a lot of different hint systems. The first, which I dislike the most, is being told what you should be doing multiple times over. If I didn't hear it the first time, that's my problem to figure out. I don't understand why I'm being told to do everything with a hint at what I should be doing literally right after. The second hint system is a mini guy named Mini Beard, who is conveniently placed nearby any puzzle that takes longer than a minute to complete. He is even completely optional, as you have to go up to him and talk to him if you're ever stuck. Doing so, he might not even provide a good enough hint unless you bother him more. This is honestly the only hint system the game needed, but I never used him in my original playthrough, but did so for this review, and will admit he's a pretty funny guy. As for the combat, it's very simple. You'll get a sword and be locked to a single swing. That is until you find a merchant who will sell you new abilities, upgrades, and collectibles for a light bulb currency you stole on your way. That's not important. After purchasing an ability, you are given a quick texted tutorial on what it does alongside an option to test it out. Saying yes will throw you in an arena with a quick hands-on demonstration. I grew to love this, as it's a nice way to learn the controls and situations you want to try the ability in. Now, I overall enjoyed the combat, however, there was very rarely any sense of threat. There are also very few abilities, and most of them feel pointless. For example, unless you're purposely going out of your way to jump at or spin towards the enemy, you're never put in a position to use them as much as I feel you should be. You're never really surrounded by more than 3, and you just never really think about jump attacking versus just jumping onto a new platform. Also, without upgrading your new abilities anyway, you're penalized for damage using them. As for the boss fights though, I was blown away by the creativity. Every fight offers something completely different from the other, and instead of just fighting with your sword, you'll be trying to defeat them at their very own game. Whether it be Lethal League, Final Fantasy, or even Punch-Out, they do a great job paying homage to a lot of titles and genres you may have seen or played once before. That being said, I heavily dislike the mage fight, mostly because of my personal hatred towards bubble shooters. However, I did love the final fight as it goes through all the previous minigames on top of ending in its own spectacular way. Amazing game design, and was such a great fight to end on. As for your collectathon, throughout your journey you'll come across art scrolls and glitch birds. Art scrolls are beautifully selected concept art from the developers hidden across the world in very easy to find locations, mostly off the beaten path. Glitch birds can be found once every chapter, with the exception of chapter 9 where the last 2 reside. They're typically in very tricky and well hidden spots, so you must keep a very keen eye while exploring. Overall, I thought they did a great job with the collectibles, and I never felt like any were unfair. Some are in very ridiculous spots, but they were quite all fun to find. I was slightly disappointed nothing but an achievement comes from it, but that's a-okay. Now, my biggest criticism comes with the vast amount of transitions and cutscenes used. I understand it's a story-focused game, but hear me out. We'll use doors as the example. Every single gate you unlock will throw you into an unskippable cutscene showing you exactly where that gate gets unlocked, disregarding the fact it's obvious and there is usually no other way to go. It forces you to just sit there for what feels like no reason at all. It can also sometimes interrupt ongoing dialogue, which in turn ruins my immersion and fluidness of the game. It wouldn't be too bad if the option to skip, fast forward, or move around during was there, but anyway. Moving on to the wonderful world of the Plucky Squire. Visually, it's stunning, and that is an understatement. I absolutely love the aesthetically pleasing visuals with the very clever dimension hopping. Not to mention, it's full of art references, such as this hidden away Banksy. And if you don't know who this is, I can guarantee you've seen his art somewhere. Now, the worlds themselves are split up into chapters, with each unlocking multiple new locations to explore. Most are very compact, while the 3D worlds become more large. There's a great variation of scenery spreading across multiple pages and even changing over time. While both worlds are visually immersive and full of color, the 3D worlds seemed a lot more bland. Whether it be from the lack of interactables, collectibles, hittables, or threats, it felt like there wasn't all too much going on outside of the main objective. Exploration didn't feel valued, and the world had a lot of wonky mechanics. It took me a while to understand the trick to jumping off beds, for example. You need to jump while in mid-air, not while landing or when you'd normally expect to jump in any other title. It just felt wrong. The biggest issue I had was with the fixed camera, which sucks because it can provide so much when done right. It is fine in most places, however there's a lot of locations where it makes the perspective platforming artificially difficult, and then attempting to explore tighter areas quite tedious. A quick fix for this would have been allowing slight camera movements with the right stick, but I know that wasn't the vision. As for travel, the entire game is played on foot, with the exception of a jetpack you get later on. You will however unlock a dodge roll which will provide you the most base movement buff you'll ever see, which I of course spammed until my pinky hurt. But overall I thought the pacing was really nice and fit all the worlds you were a part of. As for the audio, they did an amazing job with it. I don't think most people will have a hard time becoming immersed or bobbing their head to the soundtrack. Most of the songs are very well placed and fit the exact vibe they're trying to set upon. There isn't one track that felt out of place. My favorite track might be obvious, but Moonbeard knows how to party. Now, while I was quite saddened to find out none of the characters were voice acted, and I actually had to read, unbelievable I know, there is a voiced narrator throughout the game who absolutely nails it. If this guy doesn't do audiobooks, I would be surprised because he is the most soothing, read me a bedtime story voice I've ever heard. It's insane. They picked the right person here, absolutely. I will say, starting the game with full narration, following up with text-based dialogue, and then intertwining them throughout the game was a real curveball I wasn't expecting, yet it worked surprisingly well. Hey, you made it to the story section and my thoughts on it. I won't be covering the spoilers in depth, but if you would like to avoid them anyway, skip ahead to the positive and negative section below. Ready? Okay. You play as Jot, an adventurous little lad who's joined by his friends Violet and Thrash, who all live inside a storybook. As the pages turn, it tells a tale of an evil wizard named Humpgrump, who gets absolutely curb-stomped by Jot. But for some magical reason, Humpgrump defines his fate by ripping Jot out of his very pages. From then on, you must put a stop to Humpgrump's plans by manipulating the pages with even more twisted magic. Now, the storytelling is quite literally told by flipping through a kid's book you just so happen to be controlling inside and out. The amount of details, illustrations, and meta fourth wall breaking is hilarious. Very well put together and very close to what we would call a masterpiece. The cutscenes are extremely colorful, some even interactable, while others draw you in just for the calming narration. That being said though, the story is absolutely full of unskippable cutscenes, transitions, and dialogues, some of which are quite long. While I do find this to be okay during a first playthrough, having no skip button during chapter replays or beyond made achievement hunting extremely obnoxious. I can understand not wanting people to zoom through your game, but putting up prolonging blockades is not a fun way to avoid that. The third and fourth wall breaking is done and said in multiple different ways. I won't spoil them as I found them to be quite hilarious. I can however see others finding it, among other dialogue, a bit questionable, or cringe as little Timmy would say. Overall, I thought the story was very well done and extremely creative regardless of its prolonging and subtle annoyances. As mentioned before, there are a total of 20 achievements, all of which took me 13 hours to obtain, with a single playthrough taking around 8. I will not be mentioning the ones handed to you just by playing, however let's start with the more missable ones, such as Optimistic Explorer, where your goal is to simply jump off the desk. The fact they knew others like myself would do this just to try it is hilarious. Cheese mushrooms is to rearrange a sentence to create them. You think this would be obvious, but this is the one of 2 achievements I missed as I never thought to cheesify anything. Silly me. Art Collector is to find all 50 art scrolls in the game. They are honestly not that hard to find once you understand they're all hidden within interactables, behind objects, or off the beaten path. The hardest achievement award will be going to Savior of the Glitchbirds. Unlike the scrolls, there are only 10 to find and are incredibly well hidden. These took me the longest to find, and I enjoyed the slight challenge they provided, which might have been the only challenge of the game for me. Anyway, now let's go over some of the positives. Starting with, the creativity is at an all-time high, providing a bunch of new, never-seen-before mechanics and puzzles. The game is gorgeous with its hand-drawn aesthetic and mix between 2 and 3D. The story is well done and interesting enough to keep you invested, and there are a lot of collectibles, Easter eggs, and throwbacks to retro games you may or may not have played. As for the negatives, there is just way too much hand-holding ruining the fun. You can't skip any cutscene or dialogue even when replaying, and the combat can become repetitive very quickly. As for a neutral, depending on your gaming experience, it is incredibly easy. If you go in expecting a cute, fun, story-focused game that is trying its best to do a bunch of new things, you will no doubt love it. But if you're going in expecting anything else like a hardcore puzzle platformer, you will just become extremely disappointed very quickly. In conclusion, the Plucky Squire is a meta and dimension-breaking, charming puzzle platformer trying something completely new. But would I recommend it? Well, The Plucky Squire is currently available for 40 Canadian doll hairs or your regional equivalent on Steam, PlayStation, Xbox, and the Nintendo Switch storefront. Now, while I was extremely drawn to this game when it was announced over 2 years ago, after perfecting it, I can comfortably say I easily recommend it to anyone looking for a cute and new experience to shut their brain off and just vibe to. If you're looking for something a little more challenging, this might just not be for you. The asking price is a little steep, but if you can catch it on a sale, it's absolutely worth picking up. The Plucky Squire. 5 out of 6 swings. Thank you so much for watching if you made it this far. Let me know your thoughts down below, or what game I should complete next. Subscribe so you never miss a video, and until next time, take care.